Wherever you're joining from, wherever you are in the world, it's a pleasure to have you here for this session on parental use of smartphones. And I'm a bit nervous today because I want to know what these things do and how they're impacting my life. I've got a bit of a sense that it might not all be good, but there's definitely some good stuff that happens when I use this. I was kind of reflecting on this and thinking about how long these things have been around for. And I think this is an iPhone. This launched in 2007, so it's only 14 years ago. And yet they seem to have kind of completely changed our lives. It's estimated that 78% of the world's population have access to a smartphone now, which is incredible, isn't it? After 14 years. You know, the advantages, they're small, they're cheap, they're powerful. They answer all questions that my kids ask me. So that's the main advantage, I think, as a parent. I've got a 6-year-old and 2 8-year-olds. Whatever they ask me, I can answer them almost instantly and just be the incredibly clever dad. And they make all kinds of connections possible. So my kids are getting really into music and their own music now. And so I can tweet the musicians whose music they love. And sometimes we get a response. You know, I can tweet the footballers and we never get a response. But, you know, there's definitely some connection stuff going on here. But obviously there's massive disadvantages as well. You know, they're incredibly distracting, they're time wasting. You know, research shows that, you know, ironically, they also disconnect us from the face-to-face world, as well as having these connections. And it's possible, I don't know, that they're addictive. There's certainly 1 or 2 games that I play that feel like they've been designed specifically to keep me on my phone for as long as possible. And I need to play them for longer every time in order to get the same effect. So that's addiction as far as I'm concerned. So we're going to explore some of these issues today. We're going to look at how smartphones impact on our close relationships, the relationships we have as parents with our children, how they impact on families. Is it positive? Is it negative? And we're going to do that with a fantastic panel of experts that we've got here today, who I'm going to introduce in a second. We're also going to take a constructive look at a really great piece of research that was published last year, a paper called Tuning into the Effect of Smartphone Use on Parenting, a multiverse analysis. So if you take one thing away today, you're going to take away what on earth is a multiverse analysis. And then we're going to talk about, you know, so what are the practical implications of this paper for parents, for families? Where does this lead us in terms of future research? So I'm going to start off by introducing you to our panel. And as I say, we've got a really great panel. We've got Dr. Kathryn Modecki, who's Associate Professor at Griffith University in Queensland, Northeast Australia. And her work harnesses new technologies to investigate adolescents' pathways of risk and resilience across the teenage years. So welcome, Kathy, to the webinar. I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. We've also got Lara Walters. She's a researcher from the social media group at the Leibniz Institute for Wissensmedien. I hope I pronounced that right. My German's terrible. So that's the kind of Knowledge Media Research Center in Tübingen in Southwest Germany. And her research looks at parental use of social media and its impact on young people and family life. We also have some lived experience perspective here today. As always at these CAMHS campfires, we normally have a young person providing the lived experience. Today we've got a young adult, and she's a parent, Clare Walsby, a parent of 2. She's a smartphone user, and she tells me that in her spare time she's also the operations manager at the McPin Foundation mental health charity. So Claire, very warm welcome to you. Thanks for joining us and providing this kind of parent perspective. And as always, we've got my colleague Douglas Badenoch from the National Health Service, Director of the National Health Service, co-founder with me, and a black belt in critical appraisal skills. What he doesn't know about research isn't worth knowing. So we're going to start off with a couple of polls. Matt, if you could share first of all the poll that tells us who's in the audience. It'd be really nice to know what kind of people we've got here in the webinar today. So just take a second to tell us what your primary role is, what you identify with most. And hopefully there's something in that list that works for you. And I can see in the chat we've got people from joining from all over the world. So do carry on introducing yourselves. Tell us who you are. Tell us where you're from. It's really lovely to see who we've got here in the webinar.
André, just while the poll's running, could you mention about the Twitter handle or the hashtag?
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, if you want to tweet today, the hashtag is CAMHS campfire. I'll just post that into the chat. Please feel free to tell people what you think. Tell people you're on this webinar. Everything we do here is shared afterwards. So the video, all the materials that we talk about will be shared on the ACAM website, and we'll post a link to that at the end of the webinar. Great, so thanks very much for filling in the poll. Looks like our primary group represented here today is educational professionals. So 29% of you are in that group, but we've also got a real mix of other mental health professionals, some students, some trainees, some parents. That's great. Thank you. And then we've got one more poll before we start the questions. And this one is asking you to what extent you're concerned that parents' smartphone usage can harm parent-child relationships. So if you strongly agree with that statement, then that's a 10. If you disagree with it, it's a 1. So to what extent are you concerned that using smartphones is harmful to the relationship you have with your kids? Do feel free to use the chat to ask any questions you have of our panelists as we go through, and we'll try and put some of those questions to them later on in the session. If you've got any questions about language we use, feel free to post those as well. Okay, so 1 or 2 of you are not at all concerned, but the vast majority are around the kind of 6, 7, 8. So that's fairly concerned. And then 1 or 2 of you, well, I say more than 1 or 2, more like 17% of you are really very concerned. So I wonder where that comes from, that feeling of harm. We can certainly explore that as we go through. And I guess that's a good lead into the first question. I want to ask Lara, first of all, Lara Wolfers. Lara, smartphones have been around for a long time, 14 years, but in research terms, that's really not long at all, is it? I'm presuming that we don't know very much about the positives and the negatives of these smartphones on our relationships. Can you just summarize for us what you think we do know?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's actually really like that we don't know a lot about the effects of parental smartphone use on parent-child relationship quality. The problem we have at the moment actually is that usually we have some studies and some data, but all studies, at least in the social sciences, are at least some kind of biased. And the problem we have at the moment that we really don't know how biased they are because we don't have a lot of studies and data to compare them to. So that's a problem at the moment, I think. How I see the literature, and that's like my opinion, I think if you will ask any other researcher working in this area, you will get a different answer. But as I see the field, so I think we have at the moment quite some observational studies now that look at how parents use their phones at the playground or in the waiting area or in the restaurant, for example, also in the laboratory. And when you compare parents that use their phones to other parents that don't use their phones, you usually see that the parents that doesn't use the phone is more sensitive towards their child and has the better parent-child relationship interaction quality. And the problem we have here is that we don't have a lot of data on how this smartphone as a distraction source is actually compared to other sources of distraction. So of course, it's not very surprising if you compare a parent that's distracted to a parent that's not distracted, that you will find that the distracted parent is maybe less sensitive to the needs of that child. So that's not surprising, I guess. And we don't have a lot of data yet on how in which you compare actually smartphone as a distraction to other sources of distraction, so like cooking or talking to somebody else or reading a book. So we don't really know a lot of these comparisons yet. So that's like the first point. But we see at least that there like probably is, if you use it compared to non-use, that's maybe worse. Second thing is that we also see, we have a lot of studies now on how parents use the internet resources and also their smartphones. And we see that parents usually say that they find these resources provided to them as very helpful and very valuable, actually. So they use it for, like, they use all these parenting information you can find a lot of social support there. You also can find experiences of other parents, and that's something that's described quite often, is that you have the chance to normalize your experience, because on the internet you find usually some group of parents that actually has quite similar circumstances in which they live. And if you see, like, okay, they experience the same thing, then my experience is not that worse, so it's not bad, so it's kind of normal, and then you feel better about yourself as a parent. So we see these negative and the positive effects. And what we also see, I think, now is that actually the effects are also different for each person, and that's what makes it quite complex. So especially, like, are these negative effects more pronounced than the positive ones, or is it the other way around? Probably depends on what kind of person you are, what kind of parent you are. And also, and that makes it even more complex, if you compare, like, one situation to another situation for the same parent and the same child, usually sometimes smartphone use may be good because it calms the parent, for example, or it helps you get information. And in the other situation, it's maybe bad because it disturbs your parent-child interaction in this moment, and you, like, I don't know, check your mails and get even more stressed as a parent. So that's what makes it really hard at the moment. So what we see, maybe to sum up, so we see probably that there are negative effects of smartphone use. And we, I think, also see that there are positive effects. And we also see that it's complex, and that it's not the same for every person and not in every situation. And maybe also the fourth thing, and that's something I think we will talk about also today, because that's also something that Kathryn's work really shows nicely. The effects are not that big. So usually it feels like smartphones has changed a lot of the way we live. And you usually think, if you study it, there should be huge effects. But then we, like, look at it empirically, and we usually see, like, if we find effects, they're probably, they're most of the time, like, really small. So I think all in all, I would say it's complex, but at the moment, I don't see a reason to really panic on the effects of parental phone use.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you in a second before we go to our critical appraisal session, because the chat is already alive with questions, and there's a really interesting one that I'd like to put to you in a second. Keep those questions coming, everyone. That's great. I want to turn to Kathryn now and ask about what's been called problematic smartphone use. So obviously, in this age of disorders and diagnosis of all sorts of conditions, we have to create all sorts of kind of terms for this stuff. And this term was coined fairly recently in a systematic review and defined as smartphone use associated with at least some element of dysfunctional use, such as anxiety when the phone is not available or neglect of other activities. I can certainly personally relate to that. So this kind of use, problematic smartphone use, is being linked with poor mental health. It's been linked with poor sleep, and in young people, it's been linked with lower educational attainment. But the research that's been done so far can't establish a causal relationship. You know, we don't know whether it's the poor mental health that's causing the problematic smartphone use or the other way around. So there seems to be a big gap between what's reported in the media, you know, these very negative stories about digital technology and the harms they cause, versus what we actually know from scientific research. So Kathryn, is it simply that you researchers are a bit useless and it's going to take a while to catch up with this stuff?
Of course. André, that's a great question. I mean, I think anytime something new comes along, we need to catch up, yes. And I think, as Lara said, I think the science is catching up. But it's also, you know, as scholars, we're taking a much more critical eye, which I think Lara also nicely touched on. And so even that study that you were talking about, if you read the discussion section, it says it's associated with sleep and anxiety. But if you read the method section, those studies were also determined low quality in the meta-analysis itself. And I think that nicely speaks to some of the challenges we have. You know, if we go backwards, Nick Allen has this great presentation where he talks about the introduction of the bicycle and how it created this moral panic about what it was going to do to families. And you know, Lara would know this much better in her field. But, you know, if you speak with media scholars and those in human-computer interaction, we know with television, with the telephone, that we see this same cycle, right? And so even though smartphones haven't been out, that long, we have continued to see this cycle. So I just wanted to touch on one of the things that I think is the issue, is that when we talk about things like distracted parenting via the phone, that's not the same thing as phone use. And so those are lovely studies that Lara touched on, in the fast food restaurants and looking at parents being distracted by phones and how many times they're interacting with the child. Those are fantastic studies. What they're touching on is distraction, which is separate from actual time on the phone. And I think to the extent as scholars, we can be really clear and distinct in thinking about things, it will help clarify some of these points. And I completely agree with everything that Lara said, because that's another part of it, is that things get muddied. And so people are studying things like technoference, but then the headline is phone use. And the other thing they're doing is looking at things cross-sectionally and saying things like causes.
Thank you. That's great. I'm going to turn to Clare now and just give us a bit of a reflection, Clare, on what you've heard so far. How are you feeling now?
If I had to sum up in one word, it would probably be relief, I think. Mainly because, and I should probably disclose at this point, as well as lived experience as a parent of two and a smartphone user, I also have lived experience of poor mental health, so of depression and anxiety. So talking about bias, it's difficult for me to know whether my guilt and anxiety levels are just generally higher than your average. But just being a parent is hard, and knowing that any bit of technology, whether it is a television, whether it is a phone, you should technically always be doing something else. But I know that there have been times where it has been my saviour, as just something from a friend that was supportive at a time when I really needed it. But I also know that there have been times where I may have been in a slightly, toxic WhatsApp group. It wasn't toxic for everyone else, but it was toxic for me personally, just because of the competitive nature of it. And I know that impact of that, I felt that a lot longer after I had put the phone down than if it was, say, just a quick message from someone like I got last night about today saying, don't worry, you'll be fine, you'll smash this. Okay. And that was really, really brief, but it stayed with me as a positive. But I also know there's been interactions that have stayed with me long after I've put the phone down. So it's a lot more, Lara and Kathryn obviously know far more about this than I do, but they're absolutely right. It's so much more nuanced, and it's about the quality of the interaction, what you're looking at, and how you feel afterwards, and how long that feeling goes on for.
Thank you. I should apologise because I've got a drilling that started in the background. This is what happens when you do morning meetings and you've got a plumb around. You are smashing it, Clare. Thank you, Dominic, for posting that in the chat. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for being so open about your experiences. That's really brilliant. I mean, for me, it's often, particularly with the last couple of years, young mums, young dads who are at home with their kids, smartphones have been a lifeline, as you say, keeping you connected with the real world, or with the wider world. Yeah, I mean, what's your kind of personal experience of the positives and negatives of them over the last couple of years, particularly?
Is this me? Sorry, André.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Positives, being able to talk about things with my girls that I wouldn't have expected to. An example being, somebody sent us a WhatsApp video. It was when Donald Trump had been voted out in America, and it was a sort of an animated song and dance of American monuments coming to life and dancing. And of course, my daughter's heard the music and, oh, what's that? So they come over and they go, oh, who's that? Oh, that's Abraham Lincoln. Who's Abraham Lincoln? Oh, wow. What's that? Oh, that's Mount Rushmore. What's Mount Rushmore? Oh, who are these people? And it created, suddenly there was this huge shared experience, which we'd never ever have had if it not been for this, daft video that somebody had sent. So there were sort of wonderful things like that, and being able to share experiences with people that aren't there, such as when I took my daughters to their first protest in London. And my husband would have loved to have been there, but couldn't. But of course, we could take pictures and video and share them with him in real time and go, look, this is what we're doing. And it made him feel a bit more of a part of it. But I suppose, as I mentioned as well, in terms of when we went into the first lockdown, parental WhatsApp groups, how are you homeschooling? You've got two working at home parents, and me looking at this going, I can't do this. I can't, there's timetables that people have put up, and I'll be lucky if I get, my child to do half an hour on the computer. So luckily, I've learned to talk about these things, and I have a very, very sensible husband who went, just leave the group now. And I did, and that helped. But it's knowing and having the strength to do that as well, because it is difficult, because there is all this smartphone etiquette and this whole thing to do with WhatsApp groups and how you leave and what you do. And I'm quite a Luddite when it comes to social media, and for personal reasons, I don't generally get involved with it. But I know how complex it can be. And so it's a relief to me personally, but I think looking to the future, it's a bit worrying as well, just in terms of how much I might have to engage and learn more in order to support my children and make sure I'm supporting myself, I think.
I guess we've all got this kind of, we're learning this together, aren't we? Because as parents, the harms and the benefits of this stuff, so deciding to leave that WhatsApp group does sound like a very good decision, but we're working it out together. What is harming me? Is this harming me, or am I quite enjoying this? It's complicated, as you say. There's been a few questions in the chat about different types of children, different ages of children, and obviously children are incredibly varied. And children's perspectives on all of this. I wanted to ask Lara, first of all, the research that we have currently, do we know about the different impact that the parental use of smartphones has on different ages of children, or children with different, strengths and weaknesses, or what children's perspectives are on all of this?
Yes, so there are really not a lot of studies really comparing age groups. So I think, like Kathryn did this in the response to a commentary a little bit, but there are not a lot of studies that they compare age groups, but there are some studies that focus on specific age groups. And the group that's most focused on are younger children, so children between like 0 and 5, maybe that's the group most of the research is focused on at the moment. And I think so it's hard to say really, are they difference between age groups, because we have different studies focusing on different groups, but I think the concerns raised are mostly focused on the really young children, because there you can't, you don't know what this phone is, and the concerns are that you as a parent are distracted and your child doesn't know why, and that makes it hard to maybe cooking and talking something that's learned earlier. I think that's what people think, and that's why also I actually study like parents of young children, so under the age of 7. And so the observational studies I mentioned earlier are also mostly on very young children, and that's the thing we see. And when you look at the child effects, you usually see if a parent starts using a phone, that children try to get the attention back and may start acting out. And that's what for example, what was observed at playgrounds, but also at fast food restaurants, for example. But actually, so as a parent, I think that's also something that's similar to other distractions. So again, there it's really hard to really say like the smartphone is worse than other things. I think there was also a question on language development, which is also really an interesting field. I don't think there are a lot of studies out there yet. I actually know one. This was also an experiment. So, and then you try like to learn, or a parent should teach a new word to a child, and once the parent is distracted by a phone and once not, and the word was learned better in the non-distraction condition, which makes sense. And so again, it's like really hard to compare it. I think they maybe even had a control condition where they a parent wrote something. So of course it's something that smartphones might be more distracting than other things, but it's really hard to say at the current stand of research if this is something that's really a robust finding that we find across a lot of contexts and parents. And concerns of a child perspective, yes. So there are some studies asking older children, how they see their parental phone use, and like children see that and they find it disturbing. I think similar to like phabbing behavior, like also in other relationships. Children don't like it if like the parent use their phones when they're in the middle of a conversation. And so yes, there are child perspective studies, and childs don't like it. Yeah, I think that's easy to like summarize it that way. But again, I think it's about the distraction, as Kathryn already said, and not necessarily only phone use.
Thank you. We need to hand over to Douglas in just a couple of minutes, but before we do, Kathryn, I'm going to give you last words to just kind of summarize this section and maybe lead us into why you conducted the research that we're talking about today.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for everyone's perspective so far. And I think, I don't know if it was Lara or Claire both said, parenting is the hardest job, as we know. And so parenting and shame are not a good combination ever, as we know. And, and to the extent we can be thinking about how to enhance well-being of parents, it suits everybody and families. And so from my perspective, I have a background in prevention science, and I've been really thinking about, if we have so many dollars, where do we put them? And I think as I spoke to this group recently, what I said is the idea that somehow if we took phones away, that suddenly, we would be better parents, or it doesn't make sense, right? And especially when we think about the parents probably most at risk, who are not tend to be white middle class, but tend to be in other situations. So I know that Douglas is going to walk us through some of this, but certainly the field is riddled with small samples, cross-sectional data, extrapolating far beyond what we know. In early days, it sort of makes sense. And when you asked me, André, to begin with, the scientists just not caught up. I think in the last, 3 to 5 years ago, you could publish something and probably get away with it. I think nowadays we're being a lot more scrupulous and saying, no, we have enough data. We're asking this in a more nuanced way, and thinking about this more critically. So I'll let Douglas take over, but that was certainly my perspective with these data. I had a nice large sample of, it's over 10,000 people, but over 3,000 parents. And I could use existing measures, which are not perfect. They're certainly not. And I really wanted to ask about some of the robustness of the findings that I had seen. And as someone, who's a developmental scholar, but also a prevention scientist, let's ask ourselves, is this really the causal thing? And we can't ask that with these data. These are cross-sectional, but we can ask questions about the stories that are out there, because much of the literature is like these data. They're cross-sectional, they're using the same measures, and they're using them in smaller samples. But I will leave it to Douglas to speak more to that.
Brilliant. So Douglas is going to start now with the critical appraisal bit. And I think there's a poll, is there, Douglas, to kick off with, to ask people what they think?
Yes, Matt, if you wouldn't mind throwing up question 3. I thought that's been a brilliant discussion so far, and we're already getting into a lot of the nuance around the issues with types of research or just lack of data. And as we know, generally speaking, a story will trump data in the general discussion of such things. So what we're trying to do here is to push what we know from the data and research forward. And it's always, as Kathryn says, we're always going to be playing catch up to an extent. New technologies come along, and there's various ways that we deal with this. And there's always going to be people who are concerned. And maybe some of those concerns are founded, maybe some of them aren't. So this is the opportunity we have with this paper, is to try to push that conversation forwards. Otherwise, we just end up in the same place with people who've already decided, oh, it's terrible, arguing with people who have already decided it's great. And obviously the picture is a little bit more complicated than that. So thanks for response. I didn't see those results. Did they come up? Oh, here we are. Great. So thank you for responding to the poll. We'll run it again after this session just to see if our unsures have moved. But that's a very, very promising response there, Kathryn. Now I'm going to share my, I've got some slides so you don't have to look at us anymore, but we will be back. Everybody likes some slides. Now hopefully this is all going to work. If I can find the correct window, here we go, and I'll share that and I'll start presenting. So the paper we're looking at comes from a multiverse analysis of a survey of parents in Australia. And what is a multiverse analysis? That was a new one on me. So I had to do a bit of digging. And my conclusion here is that what we're doing is we're gathering as much data as we can from a cross-sectional survey along different outcomes, different exposures, different activities, and then analysing that data in all the different ways to see which things are related to each other. So this is a kind of a shorthand way of thinking about this type of study is going to throw up hypotheses that we can then test in future research. So I just want to start, I know that some of the audience will not be familiar with critical appraisal, and we tend to think of research as done by researchers who are all brilliant, and most of them are. But we need to be a little bit cautious about research. What we really need to do is to understand a little bit about this type of study. What sort of question can it answer, and what sort of question can't it answer? And we've already had lots of great comments from people who clearly have already got this. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the first thing is to say is that those relationships in our multiverse analysis, those are just associations. So they don't tell us anything about whether one causes the other. So if being distracted by my phone leads to less parental warmth, or is it the fact that I have less parental warmth that leads me to spend time on the phone? Or is there something else going on that affects both? So we can't really be certain about this. And I've included a link to XKCD, which is just the best webcomic ever around this sort of sciencey stuff. There's a few links in here, and we'll put these slides up on the event website after the session. The other thing to say about these surveys is that they're just a point in time. So we don't know the temporal relationship. What causes what came first, chicken or the egg? So it's a slice through time, and so it's somewhat limited in what we can say. A third thing, and a slightly more sort of technical thing, is that when you do lots and lots of analyses, just because of the nature of the statistics that we use to measure these associations, the more analyses you do, the more likely it is you're going to find things that appear to be significantly related but aren't. It's just chance. You know, if you sample any data, you're going to get chance variations. And it's always one of the confusing things there is that it's always possible to think of an explanation. People are very good at stories, and so in this case, if our p-value is 0.05 for green jelly beans being linked to acne, well, I'm sure we can probably come up with an explanation around the color green or the whatever E number they use. So we need to be careful not to be drawn into this sort of storifying, because it's in our nature. It's what we do as human beings. We try to make sense of the world around us. But if we're not careful, it can lead us down the wrong track. And the final thing I just wanted to say that I think particularly affects this study is that we need to have data that relates to what is a real outcome that matters to us. So we need valid ways of measuring these things if we want to study them. And I think this is again a limitation of the study, but I think it's also points to a lot of the opportunities that we have going forward from here. And you know, anytime I read an article in the press that says, you know, big data is great, we're doing all this analysis, we're just putting the data through and it's going to tell us all the answers, I always think about this cartoon, because it's if the data doesn't represent what you actually think it does, then you're just playing around with numbers. It doesn't stop people from doing it, because we all like numbers, because then you can point at them and then you're not going to get sacked because there's a number you can point at. So we need to bear in mind some of these potential limitations in this multiverse analysis. If you want to find out a bit more about how to critically appraise surveys, there's this very scary but really exhaustive tool the British Medical Journal have made available for free. And I'd recommend that if you're designing a survey as well as if you're reading it. It's a list of about 20 questions to ask about a paper that you're reading. But if you're designing surveys, it will give you an idea of what sorts of things people might be asking about your research. So in this case, our study included all parents with children who are under 18 and presumably are smartphone users. Our measures were looking at exposure to smartphone use. So what type of things were people doing on them? And what was the depth of that engagement? What was the nature of that engagement? And that's one of the interesting things about this. We talked about the complexity of the picture before. So it's good that the study has tried to measure. It's not just, are you using your smartphone? It's not just how long are you using it for? It's also, what are you doing with it? And how does that affect your relationships with your children? So are you being interrupted in your interactions with your children by your use of your phone? Is there conflict around that process, where conflict between parent and the child around the fact the parent is distracted or is using the phone? And these phenomena are kind of grouped together in the study under a kind of heading they call technoference, which is quite a nice little label for summarizing what might be different, the difference between problematic and non-problematic use of smartphones. And what we're interested in terms of outcomes is how these things affect the warmth of our relationships, the nature, quality of our relationships with our children, specifically warmth and attachment. And there was a few outcome measures in the survey that addressed those factors. So, given that this is what we're trying to understand, we can run through some of those basic critical appraisal questions. So, yes, I think we can say for this type of question, this is the right type of study. We're looking at exploring the possible different interactions of these things. So we need to capture them all and then see how they're related to one another. We can also tip our hat to the researchers because they had quite a large sample, over 3,000 people took part. They made quite stringent efforts to include everybody. This was disseminated through the national broadcasting networks in Australia. And you know, you would hope that shows that it's likely to include a representative sample of the population. Perhaps the qualifier there is it's people who are willing to interrupt their parent-child interactions in order to complete a survey. But you know, obviously you have to take part in the survey to take part in the survey. And where I think probably we need to think quite carefully is around the outcome measures and how did what we measure actually measure the quality of the relationships, the type of exposure and things like that. And Kathryn, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that once I've finished. So as I said, over 3,000 respondents, which is very impressive. And there's a very nice figure 2 in the paper, which shows quite clearly that most of the variables were not related to one another. And in fact, what the results seem to be showing was that as long as the interaction doesn't suffer from technoference, then smartphone use, particularly I think it was social media engagement, was associated with greater parental warmth. And so this was one of the, I suppose, potentially surprising results, that these tools can actually be potentially, may be a positive thing in our relationships with our children, possibly. I would just want to point to this figure in the paper. It does look quite scary. I thought it looks like a fiendish guitar or mandolin chord, but the blue, highlighted blue figures show you which analyses turned up as being statistically significant. And you can see that there's quite a significant pattern around the social media use. The blue crosses that are above the line, and that the horizontal line means there's no difference between them. Because they're clear of that line, then that means it's statistically significant. So that will be something I'll be really interested to hear comment from you about, Kathryn. So just to kind of quickly round up, these are what I see as the strengths and limitations of this piece of work. I would say this is a well done study and it's the type of study that it is. So we can't rule in or rule out causation from this data. We have to kind of be a little bit sober and think, right, what does this tell us? What doesn't this tell us? Where might we look next for more definitive information or a better understanding of what's going on? I guess the other thing to point out is just because the nature of a survey, these are self-reports, so other types of instrument might be appropriate for measuring, particularly the quality of interactions. So I guess we've already covered most of these sorts of conclusions. What I feel is the next step from this is that we need qualitative data that helps us to understand what is going on in these situations. Asking young people, asking parents what we should be looking at. My understanding is that there is some qualitative data that might be forthcoming from this study. We'll see about that. But the real value of qualitative research is that it helps you to get a nuanced understanding of all the different ranges of experience, because we're not all the same. And except we are the same in some ways. Shame and parenting probably don't go together for that might be something that applies to everyone. But we need that qualitative research so that we can identify within that interaction what do we need to be looking at. Right, that's me finished. And I just thought I would finish by showing you very smart. This has got a Scottish resident who's got the smallest smartphone in existence, and she is sitting on top of the nuts, and all the baby squirrels were lined up waiting to get on the feeder, and meanwhile the chonky floofer here was hogging the limelight. Okay, that's my quick view, and please read the blog on the website. I'll post a link to it if you want a bit more detail about my appraisal of the research. So congratulations to Kathryn and our team, and I'll hand you back to the broader discussion.
Thanks, Douglas. Chunky floover. So you haven't just learned what a multiverse analysis is, you've also learned what a chunky floover is.
Technical term.
Thank you very much. Brilliant stuff. So Kathryn, over to you. What are the implications? How do you want to respond to Douglas's ruthless appraisal?
I thought Douglas did a great job. So thanks so much, Douglas, for your close reading. I really appreciate it. And I think it's spot on. I think I should probably back up, and André, you were probably trying to get me to do this earlier, but we partnered with the national broadcaster in Australia, the ABC. And let me tell you, if there are people in Australia on, you know that they're really avid listeners. It's a real part of the national identity, and it was just an absolute pleasure. And we did go to significant lengths to really try, by going on local radio, TV, print, really trying to get a range of parents. I don't think demand characteristics were such a big deal because it's anonymous, it's confidential. And self-report, yes, we need passive measures of things like use for sure, although I think they're probably tapping different things. But let me back up and say, what we did is we used the measures that are in the literature. That isn't saying that these are awesome. It was really trying to say, okay, I know we're going to be collecting cross-sectional data. Ideally, I'm a developmentalist. I would like to see longitudinal data. And so rather than trying to do something that I didn't think would actually add to the field in the way I'd hoped, I said, well, let's take a step back and let's literally try and get everything in here we can that's being used currently. And with a big enough sample, you know, if there's going to be a correlation, it should probably show up in a sample of 3,000, right? And so my take is really that, you know, the widespread caution about widespread harm is probably not justified, given that it's been based on studies like this that are cross-sectional with these measures. That doesn't mean that for some people it's not exacerbating harm, because that's very likely. We often see in the online space things like depression and anxiety, for instance, in adolescents. We often see those harms online as well. But rather it was a call, and hopefully a call for asking some of these more nuanced questions, really trying to move beyond, may I say, white middle class samples, and thinking more critically about positives of use. And also for those most at risk, how could we help them? And I would argue it's probably not saying, we'll just put down your phone. There's probably something else going on. But I concur with Douglas's assessments very much so. And some of this is a call about our need for better measures and thinking about, you know, what is use. We had 12 different measures of smartphone use trying to tap, you know, what it is. But, you know, the other thing is now we're also online on 5 different things, right? And so how do you even begin to try and understand? We did try and look at separating by immersive use versus less immersive use, and there seemed to be maybe some patterns there, which would make sense. If you're immersed, it's harder to sort of catch up to what your child might be trying to signal or something else. But I would caution away from like, oh, it's positive, because of course that moderator effect that Douglas pointed out. And more the point was, look, these are the measures people are using. These are the types of data people are using. And really, if you look widely, these patterns are not robust around risk.
Can you say a bit more about what you perceive to be the barriers that researchers face when you're trying to reliably answer these questions?
Well, probably a lot of us as scholars can speak to this. I think getting longitudinal data is key. It's hard to get longitudinal data. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of tenacity. I have a study coming out with smartphone-based research experience sampling with teens, you know, and that was a 6-year effort, right? And so I think open science is one of the best things that's happening to this area in terms of really pushing scholars to be thinking about really high quality data. I think, you know, our measures, trying to figure out our measures, not just of tech use, but we have another paper we're working on where we're trying to measure parenting online, and how do we, you know, so as Douglas said, if you're not measuring what you hope to measure, you have a tape measure on the wrong thing, right? And so I think really what, you know, if I think about where we need to go, it's as scholars keeping each other honest, really about being really critical about our findings, what our studies really are and aren't showing. And like I said, I do think open science helps a lot in that arena. You know, Amy Orban and some other folks are really helping in that, because all of their stuff's open, meaning they're sharing their data, their measures, they're pre-registering their hypotheses. So I think, and it can, you know, it can be challenging, you know, we'll see, you know, I was surprised how much this study has caused discussion and maybe not caused, been associated with discussion and some consternation. You know, I think, you know, it feels as if I think it might feel like we're dismissing people's experiences of risk and problems, which is not the point. Like, I'm not pro technology. I'm not saying everybody get on your smartphone and stay on for 48 hours. That's, you know, that isn't the point. So I think that for me, those are the pitfalls that I've been experiencing as a scholar myself.
And I wanted to ask you a kind of follow-on question to that, because you do a lot of work, particularly on social media. What are the barriers specifically to social media researchers? I mean, one of the obvious ones seems to be, as Kathryn says, getting hold of the data in the first place. Is that beginning to open up now? Are social media companies actually letting you research and use their data?
So yes, for some researchers, but definitely not for all. So that's definitely a point. And also a point was raised earlier in the chat about self-reports and like log data, and that's definitely a problem. And there's one paper, a pilot study, showing already that for parents specifically, phone use self-reports are like have to be seen as problematic and not really measuring phone use that well. So that's definitely a problem. Yeah, I think in the social media world, what makes it harder now is I think that we have so many different platforms that are also different in how they work. So it's like a lot of studies focus on Facebook, but actually like our teens are not really on Facebook anymore. And also a lot of young parents are now a lot of them are on Instagram and looking all of these parenting pictures. So it's really hard to grasp what social media is now, because all these platforms are different. A lot of them have different norms. For example, we see it's okay to post something negative experiences on Twitter, but not on Instagram. And so the processes are really different. And I think that's one of the barriers or the difficulties at the moment, that we try to say something about social media, but social media is like not just one platform and just one thing. So we also hear it's like getting more and more diverse, and it's much harder to say this is the effect we see for social media, because for some social media it might be this way, and for the other platform it's the other way. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got another poll. We're interested in what you guys on the webinar today think of the kind of clinical importance of this piece of research. And Matt, if you could put that up for us. So do you think this paper provides valid, important evidence? Yes, no, unsure. And while you're doing that, Claire, I wanted to kind of bring you in again and, you know, give us the parental perspective on this, having heard what you've heard. Yeah, how are you feeling now?
Still relieved, bit panicked, just about, as Lara made a fabulous point there about what is social media. I have sort of limited grasp of Instagram, but that's about it. And every time I think I understand what it is, there's new platforms, and I have a teenage nephew who, as you say, Facebook and Twitter, it's just like that's not what he does. I think a lot of the things I've been thinking and noting down as I've been listening are quite selfish, but I suppose that's the bonus of being the lived experience person on the panel rather than a researcher who's supposed to be unbiased. I was thinking about the choosing to be techno-feared with, if you like, and again, this is coming from a lived experience of mental health perspective, and that sometimes the techno-fearance might come because it's beeped and you weren't expecting it, but it also comes because you've chosen to pick it up, because frankly, you just need a break from the parenting for 5 minutes, which comes with its own layers of guilt. So again, it goes back to how any future research has to be far more nuanced in terms of the quality of the interaction, how much the children are involved. I know if you asked my children, the 2-year-old already says to me all the time, "Mummy, put the phone down, put the phone away, put the phone down," but at the same time she has to have her own phone, so she wanders around with her own phone, which is just an old advice, just so she can put it to her ear and pretend, but she already recognises the interference and how my attention isn't necessarily where she feels it should be. And the older child, the 6-year-old, would say that she loves looking at music videos on YouTube, but with us, and it's a parental thing, but it's a family thing. We all get to watch it together. So yes, I'm still relieved, but I definitely would like more research to go off, and again, slightly selfishly, in the arena of lived experience of those with postnatal depression as well, partly because that's my thing, but I think it's a whole subsection in and of itself in terms of support, what is helpful, what is not, and how those interactions on a smartphone, how they carry on into family life long after you've put the phone down.
That's brilliant, Claire, thank you. So it's great to see these results in terms of what people think of the paper specifically, and we've got a higher yes than we had before. So that's really encouraging. People are persuaded that this is important and relevant. So lots of people are uncertain. I'd like to bring up the poll as well, Matt, number 5, asking about whether you're concerned about your smartphone use again, as we did before, just to see what people think. So if you strongly agree you are concerned about harmful use, that's a 10. If you're not, that's a 1. And while we're doing that, I kind of want some advice for parents from Lara, I think. You know, what advice would you give about our smartphone use? And there's something you said to me yesterday or a couple of days ago, which I thought was really interesting. You were talking about some research that looked at how the positive effects of smartphone use disappear when parents feel guilty about it. Just kind of echoing what Claire's saying there. So tell us a bit about that, first of all.
Yeah, sure. So we did a recent study, so it's called experience sampling study, where you try to measure parental experiences on their phone use, like right in the situation or shortly after it. And there we see that, so it all again shows a quite complex picture, this findings we see. But we see, we ask about stress coping, how you use your phone for coping with the stress. And parents reported in these surveys quite a lot of guilt about their phone use. And it's specifically phone use for a purpose, so it's not even like scrolling just mindlessly. And even then, guilt seems to be quite a big factor. And we see that if you feel guilty, then your the way you perceive you handle the situation well or not gets really decreases a lot. So feeling guilty seems to mitigate your experience of using your phone to your own advantage. So it's all about the perception, this study, but I think that's actually something we need to think about. So if we also make parents feel guilty, and in Germany there are quite some campaigns actually that have these kind of scary pictures where parents are asked if they have talked to their child today already, or if they just have been on their phone all day. And I think we have to think a little bit about these guilt-inducing campaigns, because then parents might feel guilty a lot, and this might actually mitigate the positive effects that are also associated with phone use. And what Clare just said, having this timeout for 5 minutes. So I did a qualitative study, and that was the most pronounced thing that every parent said. I use the phone for 5 minutes for my own bits. So we call this a solitude snacking. So it's a small snack of being alone when you are with your children all day. And I think that's something we see a lot, and I think that's actually something that can really be helpful for parents to actually be somewhere else at the same time. And but if you feel guilty afterwards, all these stress decreasing effects are vanished, because guilt is a stressor, so it stresses you. And so yeah, that would be connected to your question about what advice I would give to parents. So of course, parents need to, or I think parents should reflect on their own smartphone use. So when does it help me? When does it not help me? And because the effects are so complex and so different between persons, it's really important to reflect on yourself and not rely on others judging overall effects, but really rely also on your judgment, and also feel confident about your judgment, because you're the expert on yourself, and you're the expert on your special circumstances. So what you observe, what helps you not, is probably the best response you will get in this area. So that's something I would say to parents. And then the second thing is, don't be too hard on yourself. Phone use, only phone use will not destroy the relationship you have with your child if nothing else happens. So if you used your phone and you noticed afterwards that's what was not good, my child acted out, I was not there as I should have been, then it's very good that you noticed that, but don't feel too guilty about it, because nobody's perfect. And I think also us as parents need to sometimes step down and think about if it's really that bad, or if this guilt we feel is it should be there, or if it's simply okay to look at it, reflect on it, and then say, okay, what I'm going to do in the next situation, and not feel guilty about it afterwards all the time.
That's brilliant advice, Lara. Lots of nods. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We're out of time, I'm afraid, so we're going to have to close there. But yeah, do tell us, well, we've changed people's views a little bit. Just tell us finally what you think of this webinar. Would you recommend it to other people? 10 is a yes, a strong yes, and 1 is definitely not. It's really helpful for us to get your feedback. And do carry on posting your comments and your feedback in the Zoom chat. I think we're going to leave the webinar open for a few minutes after the panelists leave, so you can feel free to share that information there. But yeah, thanks very much to Lara, to Kathryn, to Clare, to Douglas, to the guys at ACAM. Also, thank you to our friends at the McPinn Foundation who support us with these events and have always been brilliant. And yeah, you can tweet about the webinar. The hashtag is CAMHS, campfire. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Back to you.